The stars were burning, and Ambassador Talith could do nothing but watch as another world fell to the darkness that had spread across the galaxy like a plague without cure or mercy. She stood on the observation deck of the diplomatic vessel, and her four eyes reflected the orange glow of a planet that had been home to 3 billion souls just hours ago, and now it was nothing more than a feeding ground for the Kreth Dominion. The Valori Confederacy had stood for 10,000 years as the Guardians of Galactic Peace, and 12 species had joined together under one banner to ensure that civilization would flourish among the stars, and they had believed themselves invincible, and they had been fools. The Kreth had come from the void between galaxies, and no one knew where they had originated or how long they had traveled through the empty darkness before finding this galaxy and its abundance of life. And when they arrived, they did not seek diplomacy or trade or friendship. They sought only to consume. Talith turned away from the viewport as her aide entered the chamber with trembling hands and a datapad that contained news she already knew would be terrible. "Ambassador," the young Valori said with a voice that cracked under the weight of despair, "Nexus Prime has fallen, and the combined fleet has been destroyed." The words hit Talith like a physical blow, even though she had expected them, and Nexus Prime had been their stronghold, and the combined fleet had represented the greatest military force the Confederacy had ever assembled, and 3,000 warships crewed by the finest officers of 12 species had gathered there to make their stand, and they had lasted less than a day against the Kreth swarm. How many survived? Talith asked, even though she feared the answer. Less than 2% of the fleet escaped, and Admiral Vorthan went down with his flagship, and the Kreth are already moving toward the inner systems. Talith closed her eyes and allowed herself one moment of grief before the cold calculations of survival took over her mind, and the Confederacy was dying, and there was nothing their remaining forces could do to stop it. And the Kreth numbered in the millions, and they grew stronger with every world they consumed. But there was one option that remained, and it was an option so desperate that the High Council had forbidden her from even speaking of it, and yet she knew it was the only path that might lead to salvation. Set a course for the quarantine zone, she commanded. Her aides stared at her with wide eyes filled with horror and disbelief. "Ambassador, that sector is restricted, and the protocols clearly state that no vessel may approach within 10 light years of that system." "I am aware of the protocols, but Ambassador, those creatures, the intelligence reports say they are more dangerous than any species we have ever encountered, and they nearly destroyed themselves a dozen times before they even achieve spaceflight, and they treat warfare as something to be perfected and refined." Talith turned to face her aide with a calm that she did not feel. "And that is exactly why we need them." The journey to the quarantine zone took 6 standard days, and during that time, Talith reviewed every piece of information the Confederacy had gathered about the species that lived on the small blue planet called Earth. Humanity had been discovered 60 years ago, when one of their primitive radio signals had been detected by a Confederacy listening post, and what followed was a careful observation period during which Valori scientists had studied these strange beings from a safe distance. What they found had terrified them. Humans were not physically impressive, and they were fragile creatures with soft skin and short lifespans, and they could not breathe underwater or survive in vacuum or regenerate lost limbs, and by all measures, they should have been one of the weaker species in the galaxy. But they were not weak. Their history was a record of endless conflict, and war after war had shaped their civilization, and they had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet multiple times over, and they had come within minutes of using those weapons on several occasions, and yet somehow they had survived. The Confederacy had debated what to do about humanity for years, and some had argued for making contact and offering membership, while others had insisted that these violent creatures should be eliminated before they could spread beyond Their home system. In the end, they had chosen a third option: quarantine. A network of sensors and warning beacons had been placed around the Sol system, and every star chart in the Confederacy had been updated with a simple message that read, "Do not approach." And humanity had been left alone to continue their strange existence, unaware that they had been found and judged. And Isolatetalith wondered if that decision had been the right one, and perhaps if humanity had been welcomed into the galactic community, they would have mellowed, and perhaps their violent tendencies would have been channeled into something constructive, or perhaps they would have conquered the galaxy by now. Her ship dropped out of faster than light travel at the edge of the Sol system, and immediately dozens of warning signals began flashing on her console, and the quarantine protocols were attempting to turn her vessel away, but she overrode them with her ambassadorial codes. As she approached the third planet from the star, she detected something that made her blood run cold. Ships, thousands of ships in orbit around Earth and hidden among the asteroid belts and stationed near the gas giants, and they were not the primitive chemical rockets that the Confederacy's old surveys had recorded, and these were warships with designs that spoke of efficiency and lethality and purpose. Humanity had advanced far beyond what the Confederacy had believed possible. A communication channel opened, and a human voice spoke in perfect Valori standard language. Unidentified vessel, you have entered restricted Terran space, and identify yourself and state your intentions immediately. Talith took a deep breath and composed herself, and she knew that the next words she spoke might determine the fate of the entire galaxy. "This is Ambassador Talith of the Valori Confederacy, and I come to speak with your leaders, and I come to beg for your help." There was a long pause before the voice responded. "Proceed to the following coordinates, and you will be escorted to Earth and Ambassador Talith of the Valori Confederacy. We have been expecting someone like you for a very long time." As her ship moved toward the blue planet that humanity called home, Talith felt something she had not felt since the Kreth had first appeared: hope. The council chamber of the United Terran government was nothing like Talith had expected, and she had imagined something grand and imposing like the high halls of the Phylas Confederacy, with their towering columns and floating platforms and holographic displays that showed the glory of 12 civilizations. Instead, she found herself in a room that was almost brutally simple, and the walls were plain gray metal, and the lighting was harsh and functional, and the only decoration was a single flag that showed a blue planet surrounded by stars. The humans who sat before her were equally surprising, and there were no elaborate robes or ceremonial armor or symbols of rank that she could identify, and they wore simple uniforms of dark blue, and they watched her with eyes that revealed nothing. Admiral Helena Vance sat at the center of the council table, and she was a woman who appeared to be in her middle years, with gray streaks in her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of decades of difficult decisions, and she had not smiled once since Talith had entered the room. "Ambassador Talith," the Admiral said in a voice that was calm and controlled, "you have traveled a great distance to reach us, and you have violated the quarantine that your own people established. And you say you come seeking help." "Yes, Admiral," Talith replied, and she struggled to keep her voice steady under the weight of those unblinking human eyes. "Tell us what has happened." Talith told them everything, and she spoke of the Kreth Dominion and how they had appeared from the void between galaxies, and how they had swept through system after system like a tide of darkness that could not be stopped. As she described the fall of Nexus Prime and the destruction of the combined fleet, and she did not hide the desperation in her voice because there was no point in pretending. When she finished speaking, the council chamber was silent, and the humans looked at one another with expressions that Talith could not read, and then Admiral Vance leaned forward and asked a single question. "Your combined fleet at Nexus Prime numbered 3,000 warships, and the finest military officers of 12 species commanded those vessels, and yet they were destroyed in less than a day, and I would like to know how that happened." Talith hesitated because the answer to that question was not flattering to the Confederacy. The Kreth do not fight as we do, she admitted, and when our fleets engage in battle, there are rules and protocols and traditions that have been followed for thousands of years, and we declare our intentions, and we offer terms of surrender, and we allow retreating vessels to withdraw with honor. And the Kreth? The Kreth simply attack, and they do not communicate or negotiate or accept surrender, and they swarm their enemies with overwhelming numbers, and they do not stop until everything is consumed, and our admirals did not know how to respond to an enemy that refused to follow any rules. Admiral Vance nodded slowly, and something that might have been understanding flickered across her face. You have been fighting the wrong kind of war, she said. I do not understand. Your Confederacy has known peace for 10,000 years, and your militaries exist to maintain order and to fight ceremonial battles that rarely result in significant casualties, and you have forgotten what real war looks like. The Admiral stood and walked to the viewport that looked out over the city below, and millions of humans went about their daily lives unaware that the fate of the galaxy was being decided in this room. Humanity has not forgotten. Vance continued, and we have been fighting real wars since we first learned to sharpen sticks, and we have studied conflict and refined it, and turned it into something that your species would find horrifying. That is why I'm here, Talith said. And the Confederacy once called your kind dangerous, and they built walls around your system to keep you contained. And I know this, and yet I have come anyway, because you are the only hope we have left. Vance turned back to face her, and for the first time Talith saw something like respect in the human's eyes. You have courage, Ambassador, and I will give you that, and it could not have been easy to come here, knowing what your people believe about us. I am terrified, Admiral, and I will not pretend otherwise, but fear is a luxury that the dying cannot afford. The council members exchanged glances, and then Vance returned to her seat and placed her hands flat on the table. Humanity will help you, she said. Talith felt relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by suspicion, because nothing in this galaxy came without a price. What do you want in return? Nothing that you would expect, and we do not want territory or resources or political power within your Confederacy, and what we want is much simpler. Tell me, we will handle this war our way, and there will be no Confederacy observers on our ships, and there will be no oversight of our tactics, and there will be no rules of engagement imposed by your admirals, and you will not question our methods, and you will not interfere with our operations. Talith considered these terms, and they were not unreasonable, but something about the way Vance spoke made her uneasy. Why do you require such secrecy? Because you will not like what we are going to do, and your species have spent 10,000 years convincing yourselves that war can be civilized and clean and honorable, and we are going to show you that it cannot. The Kreth have already shown us that. No ambassador and the Kreth have shown you that war can be brutal, and the lesson we are going to teach is different, and we are going to show you that war can be ended, and quickly and permanently, and in ways that will haunt your nightmares for generations. Talith should have been afraid, and perhaps she was, but she thought of the burning worlds and the billions of dead, and the unstoppable advance of the Kreth swarm. I accept your terms, she said. Admiral Vance smiled, and it was not a kind smile, and it was the smile of a predator that had been waiting patiently in the darkness for its prey to make a mistake. Then let us begin. Deep in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, there were places that did not appear on any official map, and these were the shipyards that humanity had built in secret, and the facilities that the Confederacy's surveillance satellites had somehow always failed to detect. Admiral Helena Vance stood on the command platform of Station Omega and watched as the true power of humanity awakened from its long sleep. The ships that emerged from the hidden construction bays were nothing like The vessels that humanity had shown the galaxy during first contact, and those had been carefully designed to appear advanced, but not threatening, and they had been polished and elegant and made to reassure the nervous aliens that humanity was civilized. These ships were not designed to reassure anyone. The dreadnoughts came first, and they were massive vessels covered in armor that could regenerate itself and repair damage faster than most weapons could inflict it, and their hulls were dark and angular, and they bristled with weapons that the Confederacy had never imagined. Behind them came the carriers, and each one held thousands of strike craft that were piloted not by living beings, but by artificial minds that could think and react faster than any organic brain. And these AI pilots felt no fear and required no rest, and they could calculate firing solutions in microseconds. Came the electronic warfare frigates, and these were perhaps the most dangerous ships of all. And they carried no heavy weapons, but instead house systems designed to infiltrate enemy networks and corrupt their communications and turn their own technology against them. And finally, the flagships emerged, and these were the vessels that carried weapons humanity had sworn never to use, and weapons that could tear holes in the fabric of space itself, and weapons that could collapse stars, and weapons that had been built during the darkest days of human history, when extinction had seemed certain. 300 ships in total, and it was not the largest fleet humanity could have assembled, but Admiral Vance had decided that it would be enough, and she did not want to frighten the Confederacy more than necessary. Captain James Chun approached her on the command platform, and he was a veteran of 30 years in the Terran Navy, and he had seen combat against pirates and rebels and rogue AI systems, and yet even he seemed awed by what he was witnessing. "Admiral," he said, "the fleet is assembled and all ships report ready for departure. What is our estimated travel time to Velith Station?" 14 hours at maximum slipspace velocity. Vance nodded and turned to face the holographic display that showed the current state of the galaxy, and the Creth advance was marked in red, and it had spread across nearly a quarter of Confederacy space, and billions had already died, and billions more would follow if the swarm was not stopped. "Open a channel to all ships," she commanded. The communication system activated, and her voice was broadcast to every vessel in the fleet and to every crew member who waited at their stations. "This is Admiral Vance, and in a few hours we will enter a war zone that has consumed the greatest military force this galaxy has ever known, and the enemy we face does not negotiate and does not surrender and does not show mercy, and they believe that numbers are all that matter, and that victory belongs to whoever can field the largest swarm." She paused and looked at the faces of her bridge crew, and she saw determination and focus, and perhaps a hint of the same anticipation that she felt. "They are wrong, and today we will teach them a lesson that will echo across the galaxy for the next 10,000 years. And today we will show them what humanity is capable of when we stop pretending to be civilized." On every ship in the fleet, the crews prepared for battle, and weapons were charged, and systems were calibrated, and AI units ran final diagnostics on their combat protocols. The Confederacy has spent 60 years believing that they contained us, and they built their sensor networks and their warning beacons, and they told themselves that they were safe because they had locked the monster in its cage, and they were wrong about that too. Vance smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "We were never contained, and we were waiting, and we knew that someday something would come along that the galaxy could not handle, and we knew that someday they would need the very thing they feared most, and that day has arrived." She raised her hand and pointed toward the distant stars. "When we enter that war zone, there will be no prolonged engagement, and there will be no siege, and there will be no campaign that drags on for months or years, and we will demonstrate once and for all why humanity was quarantined, and we will end this war in a single battle." The fleet began to move, and 300 warships accelerated toward the edge of the solar system, and their engines, burned with the light of captured stars in their weapons, hummed with barely contained power. To all ships and to all crews and to every man and woman who wears the uniform of the Terran Navy, Vance said as the fleet prepared to enter slipspace, "Remember who we are, and remember what we have survived, and remember that we are the species that walked through fire and came out stronger." The slipspace drives activated and reality bent. Around the fleet, as they punched through the barrier between normal space and the dimension that allowed faster than light travel, the Kreth believe they are unstoppable, and the Confederacy believes they are doomed, and both of them are about to learn what happens when you wake a sleeping giant. As the fleet vanished into slipspace, Ambassador Talith watched from the observation deck of Station Omega, and she had insisted on remaining behind because Admiral Vance had made it clear that what was about to happen was not something the Confederacy should witness firsthand. She wondered if she had made the right decision in coming to Earth, and she wondered if the cure she had found would prove worse than the disease. But as she thought of the burning worlds and the endless swarm of Kreth ships, she decided that some questions did not have good answers, and sometimes you simply had to choose between terrible options and hope for the best. The humans were going to war, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Kreth Armada at Vela Station numbered 8,217 vessels, and they had gathered there like locusts, preparing to strip a field bare, and for 3 days they had been slowly dismantling the last defensive line of the Velori Confederacy. The hive mind that controlled the Kreth was ancient beyond comprehension, and it had consumed countless civilizations across the void between galaxies, and it had never known defeat, because defeat was simply a matter of mathematics, and whoever had more ships won, and the Kreth always had more ships scattered among the debris of the Confederacy fleet were hundreds of escape pods, and each one contained survivors who had managed to abandon their vessels before the Kreth had torn them apart, and they drifted helplessly in the void, waiting for rescue that would never come. The Kreth did not kill their prey immediately, and they preferred to collect them later and process them and absorb their biological matter and their knowledge and their very essence into the ever-growing swarm. Commander Velen of the Velori Navy floated in one of those escape pods, and she had been the first officer of the battleship Eternal Dawn, and she had watched her captain die when a Kreth boarding craft had breached the hull, and now she waited in the darkness for the end to come. Her sensors detected something, and at first she thought it was another wave of Kreth ships arriving to join the feast, but then she looked at the readings more carefully and felt something she had not felt in days. Confusion. 300 signatures had emerged from slipspace at the edge of the system, and they were not Confederacy ships, and they were not Kreth, and they were something else entirely. The Kreth hive mind detected them as well, and it performed rapid calculations, and 300 ships against 8,000 was not even a consideration, and the newcomers would be destroyed, and their technology would be absorbed, and their biological matter would feed the swarm. The hive mind commanded its vessels to engage 8,000 Kreth. Warships turned toward the new arrivals, and their weapons charged, and their engines flared, and they moved as one, because that was how the swarm fought, and individual thought was weakness, and collective action was strength. The human fleet did not move. They simply hung in space at the edge of the system, and they did not advance, and they did not retreat, and they did not respond to the Kreth approach, and for a moment, the hive mind wondered if these strange vessels were automated or perhaps damaged. Then, the humans activated their electronic warfare systems. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic, and in 3,000ths of a second, every Kreth ship lost contact with the hive mind, and the signal that had connected billions of drones across the galaxy went silent, and for the first time in their existence, the Kreth were alone. Commander Velen watched from her escape pod as chaos erupted among the enemy fleet and ships that had moved with perfect Coordination suddenly began to drift and collide, and their formations dissolved into confusion, and she did not understand what was happening, but she felt hope surge through her. The Kreth drones had never experienced individual thought, and they had never made decisions without the guidance of the hive mind. And they did not know how to function as separate entities, and panic spread through the swarm like a disease. In 0.8 of a second, the human fleet's AI warfare systems completed their analysis, and they identified every reactor signature and every shield frequency and every structural weakness across all 8,000 enemy vessels. And firing solutions were calculated, and weapons were targeted, and everything was ready. In 2.4 seconds, the Terran fleet fired. Commander Velen had seen weapons before, and she had witnessed plasma cannons and missile barrages and energy lances that could cut through armor like paper, but she had never seen anything like what the humans unleashed. Relativistic kill vehicles streaked across the void, and they were simple projectiles of dense metal, but they traveled at a fraction of the speed of light, and when they struck their targets, they released energy equivalent to nuclear weapons, and Kreth ships simply ceased to exist. Gravity weapons activated, and they created targeted singularities that crushed vessels into spheres of compressed metal, no larger than a human fist, and hundreds of ships vanished in an instant as space itself became a weapon. Viral code spread through the Kreth network, and it turned their own systems against them, and weapons powered up and fired on allied vessels, and engines overloaded, and reactors went critical, and the swarm began to destroy itself. In 7.2 seconds, it was over 8,217. Kreth warships became 8,217, expanding clouds of debris, and not a single vessel survived, and not a single drone escaped, and the greatest concentration of Kreth forces in the galaxy had been erased from existence. Commander Velen stared at her sensors and refused to believe what she was seeing, and the battle had lasted less than 10 seconds, and the enemy that had seemed invincible had been annihilated with casual ease. A communication channel opened, and a human voice spoke. Attention all Confederacy survivors, and this is the Terran Navy vessel. Inevitable and rescue operations are now underway, and remain in your current positions, and we will collect you shortly. Velen wept, and she was not ashamed. Across the sector, the Kreth hive mind reeled from the loss, and it had felt 8,000 ships die in an instant, and it had experienced something it had never known before, and that something was fear. A new communication reached the hive mind, and it came from the human fleet, and it came from Admiral Helena Vance. This is Admiral Helena Vance of the United Terran Navy, and you have 12 hours to withdraw from Confederacy space, and every ship and every drone and every outpost must be gone by that time, and there will be no second warning, and there will be no negotiation. The hive mind considered its options, and it had millions of ships scattered across the galaxy, and it could simply send more forces to overwhelm these strange newcomers. If a single Kreth vessel remains after that time, Vance continued, we will find your homeworld, and we will silence it. The communication ended. Hive mind thought about the weapons it had witnessed, and it thought about the speed and precision of the attack, and it thought about how easily its connection to the swarm had been severed, and it made a calculation. For the first time in its ancient existence, the Kreth hive mind chose to retreat. The Kreth withdrawal was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed, and they did not retreat slowly or fight rearguard actions or attempt to hold strategic positions, and they simply fled across 100 star systems. The swarm abandoned its conquests and left behind half-constructed hive structures and processing facilities and billions of captives who had been waiting to be absorbed, and they ran as fast as their ships could carry them, and they did not look back. The Confederacy watched in stunned disbelief as worlds that had been lost were suddenly liberated, and refugees who had given up hope found themselves rescued by Terran vessels that moved through the sector with quiet efficiency. Ambassador Talith arrived at Nexus Prime 3 days after the Battle of Vela Station, and the system was still filled with debris from the Confederacy fleet that had been destroyed there. But the Kreth were gone, and the survivors had been collected, and the nightmare was over. She stood on the observation deck of the TNS Inevitable and watched as reconstruction ships began the long process of clearing the wreckage, and beside her, Admiral Helena Vance stood with her hands clasped behind her back. "How many did you save?" Talith asked. 12,000 from the escape pods at Vela Station and another 100,000 from Kreth. Processing facilities across the sector, and it would have been more, but many did not survive long enough for us to reach them. Talith nodded. And those numbers were a fraction of what had been lost, but they were something, and every life mattered. The High Council has asked me to convey their gratitude, she said, and they would like to discuss terms for a formal alliance between the Confederacy and the Terran government. Vance was silent for a long moment, and then she shook her head. There will be no alliance. I do not understand. The Confederacy quarantined humanity for 60 years, and you built walls around our system, and you told the galaxy that we were dangerous, and you were right to do so, and nothing that happened here changes that. Talith turned to face the Admiral in confusion, and frustration mixed in her expression. You saved us, and you destroyed an enemy that we could not defeat, and you ended a war that would have consumed the entire galaxy. And how can you say that nothing has changed? Because we have not changed, Ambassador, and we are still the same species that nearly destroyed ourselves a dozen times, and we are still the same species that treats war as an art form, and we are still dangerous. Vance walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars, and her reflection was ghostly against the darkness of space. You could conquer us all, Talith said quietly, and you could have done this centuries ago, and with the weapons I saw at Vela Station, you could have swept across the galaxy and made yourselves masters of everything. Yes, why did you not? Vance was quiet for a long time, and when she spoke her voice was tired and carried the weight of knowledge that Talith could not fully comprehend. Because we have seen what we become when we have no enemy to fight, and when there is nothing to threaten us, we turn on each other, and we have fought 1,000 civil wars, and we have committed atrocities that would make the Kreth seem merciful by comparison. She turned back to face Talith, and her eyes held a sadness that seemed out of place on such a powerful figure. The quarantine was not a cage, Ambassador, and it was a mercy, and for us, and for you, and as long as humanity had a potential threat out among the stars. We had something to prepare for and something to unite us, and we built our fleets and trained our soldiers and told ourselves that someday we would be needed. And now you have been needed. Yes, and now the galaxy knows what we can do, and the Kreth will never return because they have learned to fear us, and no other species will make the mistake of thinking that conquest is simply a matter of numbers. Talith considered these words, and she thought about the power she had witnessed and the casual ease with which the humans had erased 8,000 warships, and she understood what Vance was saying. You are afraid of yourselves, she said. We are terrified of ourselves, Ambassador, and any species that is not terrified of humanity has simply not been paying attention. The reconstruction efforts continued outside the viewport, and Confederacy vessels worked alongside Terran ships to clear the debris and search for any remaining survivors. What happens now? Talith asked. Vance allowed herself a small, tired smile, and it was the first genuine expression Talith had seen on the Admiral's face. Now we go home and we put the fleet back to sleep, and we return to our quarantine zone, and we hope that no one is ever foolish enough to wake us again. The Confederacy will not forget what you have done. We are counting on that, and let the memory of Vela Station serve as a warning, and let every species in this galaxy know that humanity stands ready, and let them know that we prefer peace, but we are very, very good at war. The Terran fleet began to assemble for the journey back to Sol, and 300 warships that had changed the course of galactic history prepared to vanish back into the darkness from which they had emerged. Talith watched them go, and she thought about the small blue planet in the quarantine sector, and she thought about the strange, violent, beautiful, terrible species that called it home. Humanity had come, and humanity had ended a war in seconds, and humanity had left. That was perhaps the most terrifying part of all, and they had not stayed to claim victory or demand tribute or establish dominance, and they had simply done what needed to be done, and then they had gone home. The galaxy would never look at the quarantine zone the same way again, and every species would know that behind those warning beacons and sensor networks, there waited a force that could end civilizations in moments, and they would know that humanity chose not to. As the last Terran ship vanished into slipspace, Ambassador Talith made a decision, and she would recommend that the quarantine remain in place, and she would recommend that the warning beacons continue to broadcast their message, but she would also recommend that the message be changed. It would no longer read, "Do not approach," and instead, it would read, "Here there be dragons," and it would serve as a reminder to all who saw it that some sleeping giants should never be awakened unless you have no other choice, and if you have no other choice, then pray that the dragons decide to help you, because Talith had seen what happened. When they did not, the stars continued to burn, and the galaxy continued to turn, and somewhere in the darkness between worlds, the Kreth hive mind nursed its wounds and contemplated a universe that had suddenly become far more dangerous than it had ever imagined. On a small blue planet in a quarantine system, humanity returned to their lives and their petty conflicts and their endless struggles, and they told themselves that they were ordinary, and they told themselves that they were just another species among many, but they knew the truth, and now the galaxy knew it too. The end.